Yes. So welcome everyone to our web debate in March. Today we again have an extremely interesting topic, and we kind of continue our theme of reflecting on the United Nations because this year marks the 75th anniversary of the organization. Just to give everyone a background, these web debates are organized by Diplo Foundation in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. My name is Katharina Höhne. I will be moderating the debate, and I'm a senior researcher at Diplo Foundation. So as I said, this year we started a theme of looking at different issues related to the United Nations as it marks the 75th anniversary of the organization. And in this web debate, we are asking about the UN beyond the West, and especially how do countries from the global South make their mark? We know that membership of the organization has grown steadily since its inception, and new members have shaped the face of the organization. And in particular, states from the Global South have impacted the structure and the functioning of the organization by working in UN General Assembly committees, by being elected members of the Security Council, and over the last couple of decades, by pushing for Security Council reform. So states have left their mark on how the organization works. At the same time, we do see power imbalances between the global north and the global south, between smaller and bigger states. So the question is, how can we address this? And in order to unpack this question, we invited two speakers to this web debate. With me, I have Dr. Eugenio Vargas Garcia. Thank you for being with us today, Eugenio.
Thank you for having me.
And our second speaker, who cannot be with us today for unforeseen personal circumstances, Ambassador Asoke Mukherjee. Let me just say a few words about Ambassador Mukherjee, who is an Indian career diplomat and has spent 37 years as a career diplomat. Among other things, he represented his country to the UN in New York between 2013 and 2015. And because he cannot be with us today, I would like to focus your attention on a blog post that he's written for us. And in this blog post, he's unpacking some of the issues that are relevant to our debate today. So I'm just posting the link in the chat box. If you want to follow up on this, please do, and please through this way kind of get an insight into well, his thoughts and some of the things he would have shared today if he could be with us. Of course, we will make sure to invite him another time to one of our web debates. But most importantly, let me say a few words about our speaker for today, Dr. Eugenio Vargas Garcia. Eugenio is a senior advisor on peace and security at the Office of the President of the 74th UN General Assembly. And in this role, he leads on matters pertaining to the Fourth Committee, the Security Council, peacekeeping, and cybersecurity. As a Brazilian career diplomat, he served at embassies in London, Mexico City, and the Brazilian Permanent Mission to the UN in New York. In New York, he was the deputy political coordinator of the Security Council team during Brazil's latest term as non-permanent member. And I think these are exactly the kind of experiences that we will be able to draw on during this debate. Let me also mention that Eugenio will draw on his, or speak in a personal capacity in this web debate. And from that perspective, he will share his personal views, but also his reflections as a scholar of international relations. So once more, Eugenio, it's a pleasure to have you. Let me also say, yes, we are extremely, extremely pleased. And let me also say that this web debate is meant to be as interactive as possible. And this is the important part where our viewers come in, because as we start this debate, we are looking for your comments and questions, for your views and for your perspective. You can post these in the chat window on the left-hand side of the screen, and I will be monitoring and I will be looking at the kind of comments and questions that are coming in and then bring them back into the debate with our speaker today. In preparation for this debate, we kind of thought, what kind of questions should we be looking at to kind of get us started? And we decided to, well, start with the historical perspective. So kind of the first theme or the first question I would like to bring into this is, Eugenio, how would you describe the impact that countries from the Global South had on the UN over the past 75 years?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation, Diplo Foundation. I'm very happy to be here with you all. I think we should start with the establishment of the United Nations in 1945. Because as we know, the organization was created under very unusual circumstances in the wake of the World War II. And by then, the big three, the US, Britain, and Soviet Union, they had the leadership. And China joined the four policemen in the Dumbarton-Ox Conference in 1944, which was focused basically on security, how to secure peace and avoid another catastrophic war in the future. In 1945, in the San Francisco Conference, France joined the four policemen. And these five countries were specifically named in Article 23rd of the United Nations Charter. So if you go to the charter and see this Article 23rd, you see the names of the P5, including the Soviet Union is still there. And so how about the Global South in 1945? I think the great political divide in San Francisco was between the Big Five, or as we call now the P5, and the rest. The press used to refer to the rest as the Little 45. And this divide was one of the reasons for many disagreements, because the great powers, they wanted their proposals to be accepted, but the minor powers wish to have their voices heard as well. So they have this situation. So in the beginning of the UN, the main group of developing countries was Latin America. They were a group of 19 countries. Europe was also heavily represented, but the rest of the world, with some notable exceptions, was dominated by colonialism. India, for instance, was still under British rule, and Africa was the great continent, not represented in San Francisco. Only 4 African countries sent delegations, and these were South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Liberia. So, but despite difficulties, countries from Latin America and others were relatively successful in San Francisco in their efforts to include principles of justice and international law in the Charter. Because this was a matter that had been neglected in Dumbarton-Ox, because as I said, the focus was security mostly. So at stake was the notion that maintaining order could not be the sole objective of the organization, and that military force alone would not be able to keep the peace. So these countries from the Global South now, as we understand, they managed, for example, to give more powers to the General Assembly. Article 11 of the Charter, our colleagues from the audience can later double check the Article 11 and the powers that the General Assembly, that in the original project, the General Assembly had really a minor position in terms of the powers to take action and take initiatives, especially in matters on international peace and security. And let me say that a nice contribution to remember came from a few female delegates, because women were less than 2% of all delegates in San Francisco. And these female delegates included from Latin America, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Uruguay. They managed to include in the Charter reference to the rights of women. So Article 8 in particular of the UN Charter. So the creation of the UN shows that the Global South can indeed make their mark It's not easy. Sometimes it doesn't seem to be enough, but it's possible and desirable. And moving forward, I think the first decade is, of the United Nations, the membership was not universal, as we know. During the Cold War, Soviet Union was afraid that the US and other Western member states would use their majority to adopt decisions against the interests of Moscow. And resorting to the veto by the Soviet delegation was a response to that. In the 60s, UN politics began to change, and thanks to the process of decolonization, with large numbers of independent countries from Asia, Africa, and beyond joining the organization. So by then, the so-called Third World had organized big coalitions, such as the Non-Aligned Movement or the G77, in order to push agenda items more in line with their interests. And in the 70s, this Western automatic majority in the beginning of the UN, this majority from the West was clearly lost, and Third World member states succeeded in adopting several resolutions in the General Assembly to address their concerns. For example, on decolonization, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the idea of a new international economic order. And remember that the UNCTAD was created in 1964 to add a different perspective on trade and development, comparing with the GATT. So there is a long story of North-South relations and an interesting debate about sometimes the lack of concrete results arising out of some of these initiatives from the Global South. But all in all, I believe this is the framework we still see today. The Global South has the numbers. So if a mix of voting power and coalition diplomacy working together, these countries can obtain decisive majorities and promote their views in a way that either the West or other groups cannot simply ignore.
Yes, thank you for issuing so many important reminders. For example, that states from the so-called Global South were there at the inception of the organization. I think that's a very important perspective to keep in mind. The other thing, strength in numbers, and I think there you already hinted at some of the strategies how countries from the Global South can make their mark. But I want to build exactly on that by shifting from this historical perspective to, well, your personal experiences and perspective. So I mentioned in the introduction that you were part of the team when Brazil was an elected member of the Security Council just about 9 years ago. And if you can tell us a little bit about your experience there, your reflections, anything that could help understanding this a bit better, because I understand that countries lobby for being an elected member in the Security Council, and those countries who do get elected, that's a very important step for the countries, but also for the country, for the coalitions that the country is in. So, yes, please share some reflections with us from this time.
Yes, thank you. My personal experience for a while was, as you said, mostly focused on Security Council as a delegate when Brazil was a non-permanent member back in 2010, 2011. I remember very well the extremely hard work overloads, a very busy monthly program of work, long meetings, almost every day, not to mention emergency situations during the weekends or anytime during the week. So the commitment required for delegates to be able to deliver is really amazing. So I remember that sometimes it's like delegates may feel like the lone soldier in the front line, especially from the Global South. So as they are trying heroically to hold on and survive the meetings with barely no support at all sometimes. So this idea of personal sacrifice may push delegates to go beyond their call of duty. But this is not actually the best option institutionally speaking, for countries from the global south, I think that's a point to stress, that they need to be prepared and they need to have all the support they need, they require to do the job. And delegates from the elected 10, as the E10, they are always seeking ways to level the playing field with the P5, for example. Otherwise, they will have a hard time climbing the hill to stay in the game. And of course, I also learn a lot about politics in the UN and the Security Council in particular. So there is always this dynamic balance between power and representation in the body. The Security Council is not a machine, but it's a political body. So it's a place for coded diplomacy, where protocol and procedure, these matters are really important. So the P5, they enjoy a special position, not only because of their veto power, but also because due to their unparalleled experience and institutional memory. And most elected newcomers from the E10, for example, in most states, on the contrary, they have no institutional memory, few embassies around the world, and they must struggle to catch up with from the very first day when they take their seats. So this is really hard for small states, for example. And they, of course, we from the E10, we start with great expectations and hope that we can do something and different. But in a few months, the impact of reality sinks in. So if we have divisions sometimes obstructing the work of the Security Council, of course, there is a failure of the Security Council sometimes to uphold its decisions and international law, or in terms of implementation of Security Council resolutions. And I think the idea is that developing countries, they must be prepared. So I think the most important lesson I learned is the importance of preparation, even before taking the seat in January. So my advice for colleagues and delegates from the Global South is prepare seriously before starting your term, approach organizations, experts for advice, take all the courses available. For example, Diplo Foundation, you should take all the courses Diplo Foundation offers. And the idea is to be knowledgeable and acquire skills, so not to feel intimidated. Sometimes the atmosphere is intimidating for newcomers, and you must show a good degree of ambition, courage, and always seek political solutions and strive for consensus, take initiatives. It's like you need to work in the space left by disagreements among the P5, and always insist on the application of working methods or best practice. Sometimes they are agreed on in paper, but they are not really implemented. So the E10 has a key role in remembering everybody in the council that what is agreed should be implemented. So improvements are always possible, even small ones, despite all difficulties. So it's not an easy job, but I think there is room for representatives, delegates from the Global South to make a difference.
Yes, I mean, again, thank you for reminding us of a couple of really important points, which is even on this level of capacity or resources, there's already an imbalance in the Security Council, what you just reflected on, that the elected 10 often struggle from a lack of resources, or comparatively a lack of resources, the lack of institutional memory that you mentioned, the need for capacity building. I mean, these are challenges we see in a lot of venues in diplomacy, where smaller and bigger states get together, and there's already an imbalance even before negotiations have begun on the level of resources, on the level of capacities. And so you reflected really well on the need for capacity building, for building institutional memory. What I would like to ask on this question is to what extent are coalitions, building coalitions, or relying on established coalitions important for the elected 10, for a country like Brazil, who you had this experience in the Security Council? What is going on there? Is this a possible way of addressing this kind of imbalance that we just described? And to what extent is it working, and what could be done better from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just a quick note. I think although the term Global South is very popular, and we use it on many occasions, including this web debate, this is not geographically precise. Even if we use Global South to refer to developing countries in general, this is not a homogeneous group. In case of Brazil, it's a mid-sized country, a regional power, and we include in the Global South mid-sized, small, poor, less developed countries. They come in many shapes and forms. For instance, not necessarily a small state is a poor country. But Global South is a convenient way to address common problems developing countries face in terms of economic and social development. And for many, for example, India belongs to the Global South. But if you compare India and a small island in the Caribbean, both UN member states, they are obviously very different. So just to keep this in mind for the sake of accuracy and academic rigor. But yes, I agree. I think, as I said before, the Security Council normally reflects political realities. This makes it difficult to negotiate when some members have specific interests on a given issue. And it's also difficult in terms of coalition building for the E10 to be organized as a group. Because theoretically, they can block any decision requiring a 9 votes majority. But there are often different views and divisions among the E10. So, and what we see is a distinct dynamic depending on the issue at hand. So these coalitions can be different if we are talking about a problem in Africa or in Palestine or any other issue on the agenda of the Security Council. But yes, I think nowadays we have more coordination among the E10, and this is a very welcome development. I think the E10 must invest more in dialogue with the Secretary General, the Secretary, senior staff of the organization. We always with this in mind, that to level the playing field in relation to the P5. But it's important to say that the E10 should not be seen as a group against the P5. Because the council dynamics is more complicated than that. So it has a European Union member states, for example, which are in both sides. We have countries from EU, they are P5 or they are from the E10. So if they have a European common position, it's not there is no opposition between P5 and E10. You see, just an example that sometimes reality is more complicated. But yes, growing polarization among the P5 is really not good for international peace and security, and that's where the E10 can help. So building bridges or promoting moderation, balanced views, political will, and proper follow-up at all levels. And I think even when the elected members they leave the council, they must sustain this momentum and take advantage of the experience and knowledge gathered during the time they spent in the council. And for example, reaching out to other non-members and share their experience, make their inputs heard, and try to secure a follow-up for their initiatives. So basically, I think it's a challenge for Global South, but it's important to highlight that it should be done. The contribution of the E10 is too important to be ignored.
Definitely. Also, thanks for kind of addressing this definitional problem that we're facing in terms of how do we speak about the countries that we want to speak about when we say global south. We used to say first world, second world, third world, which now seems inappropriate. Then there is this distinction between developed and developing countries, which has its own challenges, and then obviously global south and global north, which doesn't really fit in terms of geographical boundaries. We just had a question on this in the chat, which I hope we started to address. But I think no matter the term we're using, we will face some challenges in terms of inclusion, in terms of accuracy, in terms of political acceptability of trying to define this. It's a real challenge. So we have a number of questions coming in, and I would like to thank our audience very much for these questions. So one of the first questions that came in comes from Ambassador Kishan Rana, who is a senior fellow, senior lecturer with Diplo Foundation. He is an Indian ambassador, and he kind of in his comment reminds us why inclusiveness is important and why voices from smaller countries, from the global south, are important. So he kind of looks at the UN Human Rights Charter and reminds us that there seems to be an omission right in the center of the Human Rights Charter. He says there's no mention of a right to a decent life, freedom from hunger, and a right to economic development. And he says this is precisely because there was a relative absence of countries from the global south, which kind of led to this omission. So Eugenio, I don't know if you want to comment on this, or if you have a similar example in mind that really highlights why this why it's important to be inclusive and why it's important to bring to the table.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. Yes, I think it's sometimes difficult for the global south to make their mark, even because of these divisions. As I said before, it's not a homogeneous group. So sometimes we can think that the global south could act as a bloc, but it's not always the case. But the contribution they can make is really important. So, for example, peacekeeping. It's sometimes the blue helmets, they are seen as the symbol, the most important symbol of the organization. For people think of the UN and they think of the peacekeepers and what they do on the ground and the image of the blue helmets. And if we ask ourselves, who are the peacekeepers now? And we know that developing countries now provide most of the military component for UN peacekeeping operations. And they are among the top troop contributors. We can remember Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Rwanda, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Egypt, Indonesia, Ghana, Tanzania, Senegal. You go on, and because these are really important. This is an important contribution in terms of peacekeeping for the image of the organization itself. But to answer this question, let me focus for a moment on small states. I believe this is important because small states, they tend to operate in accordance with the rule of law and international legitimacy in multilateral settings. So they have sometimes a contribution that the great powers are too busy with their concerns or their interests, and small states can remember the importance of respecting international law and human rights, as the question was also highlighting. And I think there is a particular phenomenon. It's the niche diplomacy, because small states, because they have limited resources, they select one topic as a single top priority to push forward. So sometimes it's pretty obvious. The state of Palestine, for example, as a UN non-member observer state, the Palestinian influence at the UN is undeniable, and they enjoy a lot of support, but for obvious reasons. So they have this one single topic, which is of course central to their job. But for example, small island developing states, SIDS, Samoa, Fiji, so many others, they they are also working hard in terms of mobilizing public opinion for climate change and global warming. But not only that, as SDGs, and their motto is Island Voices, Global Choices. And then you see that uh, the idea of niche diplomacy is like you can select an issue in particular and go for it. So Tajikistan, for an example, uh, water for sustainable development. This is something that is very important for Tajikistan. And now I went to Dushanbe a couple of years ago, and I saw the president of Tajikistan speaking during the UN conference, and which was broadcasted live on national television. So it's sometimes a way that small states can find to make their mark, even if limited resources, but concentrate on focusing on one topic at a time.
Thank you for these reflections. I'm just monitoring the chat, and it's really interesting to see the kind of questions that are coming in. And actually, we started to have a set of questions that are more focused on the role of Brazil in particular. I just like to mention again that you are speaking in a personal capacity, but I think you're still very well positioned to address these kind of questions. So one question we had on YouTube addresses a very important topic that I also wanted to bring up at some point, which is Security Council reform, of course, and Brazil there has a very particular role to play. The question is, I would like to understand how India, Brazil, Japan, and Germany communicate and decide their agenda for UN Security Council reform. And obviously this has been going on from my perspective, quite a long time. And it's one of many proposals for Security Council reform that comes from these 4 countries. So what is your reflection on that? Obviously, it's a very important point to question the Security Council and its current set of memberships and the distinction between permanent and elected members. Yet it seems that it's a very difficult issue to even start to address. So what are your reflections on this
yes,
topic?
thank you so much for the question. Yes, the reform of Security Council is on the agenda. The Secretary General said, and all the Secretary Generals in the past also said the same thing, that the UN reform won't be completed without Security Council reform. So it's pretty much on the agenda, because in terms of general UN reform, we had this initiatives by the Secretary General in these 3 tracks: peace, security, architecture, management, and the repositioning of the UN development system. So these are now being implemented, but Security Council reform is still being discussed. Have the intergovernmental negotiations, let me call it IGN, here in New York. It's in the informal plenary of the General Assembly. So any member states can join. I think it's important for countries of the Global South to engage in the IGN process. We have 2 co-chairs. They are co-facilitators now, currently ambassadors of Poland and from the United Arab Emirates. So they have been conducting this process on behalf of the President of the General Assembly. And as everybody is fully aware, we have different views among member states on how to move forward. And we have these groups of interest that, like you said, the G4, those united for consensus. We have the L69, which is a group of developing countries from different regions. And they also are in favor of expansion of the council in both categories, permanent and non-permanent members, and others, of course. And the challenge is how to reach a concrete outcome from these discussions, because they are still informal. So it's like member states are exchanging views, but they are doing so for many years now. And of course, it's the position of G4 is that we should move forward quickly and reach a concrete outcome sooner rather than later. So it's a very politically charged question with many views among member states, and that's why we think as the G4 countries, they are trying to push this idea that for the council to secure its place in effectiveness, legitimacy, representativeness, they should be expanded and enlarged and reformed in both categories, of permanent and non-permanent members. So I think it's rather a question of time and how member states will engage in this conversation and in the negotiations of the intergovernmental process in New York. And also, of course, it's not only Security Council reform is important, but of the revitalization of the General Assembly, because it's still there's work to be done in this area, but this perhaps we can address in a different question.
Thank you. And I think when we talk about membership reform in the UN Security Council, this is a really important question for the future of the organization. But I think there's another important point to be made, which is when we speak about UN Security Council reform, we're speaking about at least two different things. One is procedural reform, transparency, for example, reform of some processes of how decisions are made on the one hand, and then membership reform. And I think, in my opinion, there's a lot of progress that we've seen over the last couple of years on procedural reform. At the same time, membership reform is obviously the much more political question and therefore the much more complicated question. Yet, I think it's a question that needs resolving one way or another when we look at the next 75 years of the organization. So we spoke about the G4 and their particular focus on Security Council reform, or their particular proposal of Security Council reform. There's another grouping that Brazil is a member of, and in the chat we had a question on the BRICS countries, and in particular if there's a connection between this kind of the BRICS grouping and activities at the UN and kind of leaving a mark at UN decision making or topics and policies. Are there any reflections on this that you could offer?
Yes, I think member states, they find different ways to organize themselves in terms of diplomatic coalitions and articulations in the United Nations. And of course, any country belongs to a region, and sometimes regional group is very important for them. So in Latin America, South America, we have groups, then Brazil belongs to these groups. So it depends on which setting we are talking about. And in the case of BRICS, sometimes we find situations where there is a BRICS position, but it's not always the case. And so it's much more country. Before being country specific, it's issue specific. So you take a given topic in the UN and you have these different coalitions and different positions from member states individually and member states acting as groups or coalitions, or in this case the BRICS is a group in a coalition, and sometimes they can share the same position and act as a group. Sometimes it's not the case. For example, Fifth Committee or some they can share the same view sometimes, and then move forward in terms of just one voice. And then, so this will, of course, make much more effective actions. And coming back to what you said in terms of working methods, just to make this point in terms of working methods of the Security Council. And since we are talking about the Global South, it's interesting to remember the experience of the Small Five, which was a group, if I'm not mistaken, from several countries consider themselves to be small, like Costa Rica, Jordan, Liechtenstein, Singapore, and Switzerland. Incidentally, they were small, but not all of them were from the Global South. That was also the point that we should always have in mind. And the Small Five, this group used to work to improve the working methods of Security Council. So it's another example of the power of articulation in coalitions, and they were pushing forward this agenda and how the council could be enhanced in terms of their effectiveness. And now this group, the Small Five, was enlarged and rebranded as the ACT, the Accountability, Coherence, and Transparency Group. And they are also championing with others a code of conduct on limiting the use of veto by the P5. So it's really an important contribution that I wish to highlight as well for this web debates.
I very much, I very much agree on the importance of this kind of contribution. Also, it might be a way of introducing reforms more gradually and in a way that might be more acceptable than pushing for reform of especially permanent membership in the Security Council. So it's a very important initiative to keep in mind. And as you said, not just pushing from the Global South, but pushing from so-called small states, which also links actually when we talk about the use of veto and kind of restraint or applying restraint on the use of veto. It's a very important normative question. And again, it is smaller states that are pushing for this kind of, for this perspective. And it goes back to a point you mentioned earlier about upholding international law, respect for established international norms. So the web debate is slowly drawing to an end, which again brings me to our audience. If you have any last pressing questions that you would like to ask our speaker, please go ahead, because otherwise we will not be able to include that question. But also let me slowly start to draw to an end by looking ahead. So we started this debate by looking at the historical perspective. Let's kind of start to close the debate by looking ahead into the future. So for example, the next 75 years. And so here, what I would like to hear your reflections on is what reforms are crucial for the next 25 years, for example, in terms of equal and equitable representation. What kind of reforms would you like to see for the future of DN to kind of make it proof for the future challenges ahead?
Thank you so much. Yes, looking ahead to the future. As we discuss Security Council reform, it's on the agenda. Also, revitalization of the General Assembly. So these are all works, unfinished business that the UN as a whole must address. Member states must engage in these processes. And this is also an invitation for the Global South and Global South countries to engage more in these discussions. And but I was also mention another in terms of reform or improvements needed. It's gender equality and empowerment of women in the United Nations. Because gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but it's a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. And we need to identify in the UN all these barriers that hinder women's full participation in leadership and share this best practice that can accelerate women's empowerment in the organization. So we have a gender parity that has already been achieved at UN high-level senior management. But now the challenge is to push for parity at all levels in the UN system. And this is a commitment not only by the Secretary General, the President of the General Assembly, but all the UN leadership. And of course, the UN women is working hard to make it a reality. And now this year, we are looking to the celebrations and commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the UN. So the theme for this commemoration is the future we want, the when we need. We affirm our collective commitment to multilateralism. And I think the main idea is to listen to people. And so we have a number of initiatives to secure an inclusion and give voice to young people, women, girls, persons with disabilities, people in general, and to listen to them, how they feel, their hopes for the future, for what the UN should be doing. So instead of the UN trying to lecture other people or to say that the idea of sometimes of commemoration and an anniversary is to remember everything we did, but in this case, for this year, the idea is to listen to more to people. So it's interesting that in some events, the Secretary General, for most events, he is the keynote speaker. But in some events now, he is the keynote listener. So that during the event, he will be listening to young people, for example. And so now the President of the General Assembly is also helping with the preparations. And most important is also to remember in September, there going to be a high-level meeting of the General Assembly on the 21st of September for the anniversary of the UN. So this is going to be a leaders summit, and in a declaration, a political declaration will be issued by then, and hope this declaration will be adopted by consensus. So I think most of these ideas of plans for the future and this vision for the organization should be included in this political declaration in September. So now member states will start engaging in this process. Again, it's you have two co-chairs, and Qatar and Sweden. They are leading on this, and they are guiding the discussions. So the member states will be negotiating zero drafts, and then we'll have this political declaration hopefully adopted by consensus in September. So I think also from our side, in terms of the presidency of the General Assembly, will be organizing an important event in April. It's the International Day of Multilateralism and Peace, Diplomacy for Peace. It's going to be on the 24th of April. This was an initiative by the non-aligned movement a couple of years ago. So last year was the first time when this International Day was celebrated. And again, so this is an initiative coming from the Global South, from the non-aligned movement, to highlight the importance of multilateralism and how to strengthen the organization. So the President of General Assembly decided to make this one of his most important events during the session. So we'll be giving special attention to this International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. And of course, many other initiatives, but so we don't have much time, but it's whole set of initiatives and discussions that are now going on here in New York and beyond.
Yeah, and thank you for kind of tying us in to some of the things that will be happening this year. What I also really liked was this idea of really focusing on listening more, and again, similar to what happened with the Sustainable Development Goals, kind of starting to bring in more people in the consultation process before these kind of decisions are taken. So that's really great to see. We have two final questions, and I think both of them really allow us to zoom out and therefore provide a way of wrapping up the debate. First question from Hans Mbale, who asks you to look at South-South cooperation, especially in terms of capacity building, sharing experiences, and technological transfer. So the importance of this, but also perhaps challenges related to this. The other question comes from Professor Alan Franklin, who asks you to share your reflections on customary international law. And he says, obviously, it's composed of state practice on the one hand and judicial opinions. But when we look at the practice of states, to what extent can states from the global south unify to change and address the principles of customary international law in a positive way? So these two very big questions that really bring us back to the... Over to you, Eugenio.
Thank you again. Yes, I agree. South-South cooperation is extremely important and necessary. And we have a number of discussions in the UN about this and follow-up process on a number of issues regarding South-South cooperation. I think more than ever, if we can manage to articulate better the global south, everybody will win. So, for example, we talk a lot about Security Council today. If we had some sort of south-south exchange in terms of experience of elected members, so sometimes that what happens that the non-permanent member, they leave the Security Council and their experience is lost, and the newcomers, they arrive with like starting from scratch. And why not? Maybe we should have a mechanism or some sort of interchange, or that's in terms of South-South dialogue, in terms of experience in the Security Council, that would enhance the contribution these countries would be able to make, even for staying in the council for only 2 years. So the idea that this mutual support would enhance everyone's capabilities and expertise, and this would, of course, be positive for the Security Council and the UN as a whole. And the other issue was customary international law. Again, we also mentioned that small states, they are pretty much supportive of international law. So I think there is this is a role that they can play in terms of supporting and advocating in favor of international law, including customary international law. As I fully agree with the viewer on that. So I think in terms of contribution, as I see it, the Global South should always speak on behalf of multilateralism, international law, international legitimacy, to strengthening the multilateral system, the United Nations, speak on behalf of collective action by humanity. Because today, more than ever, collective action and international cooperation, they are vital for our future. You see now the coronavirus outbreak and how we need international cooperation to cope with these pandemics and these outbreaks. So should be our daily business to enhance multilateralism every day because of the need to address these global challenges. The coronavirus is just an example, but others, of course, climate change and so many others that need international cooperation, need the global south to be engaged, need collective action, and need a multilateral setting to be discussed, and so that decisions can be made and member states can take action on these challenges. I think we are approaching the end of the web debate, and it's like trying to wrap up a little bit our discussion. I think this is not only a responsibility for the global south, but something that the global south is in a good position to do so, to support the United Nations and multilateralism in general.
Thank you. And these were perfect final words, I think, and the best place to wrap up on. All that's left for me to do is to say thank you to our participants for their questions and for making us look at many different topics and really enhancing the debate through the questions and comments. So thank you for joining us today, if you're watching. But most importantly, thank you to our speaker, Dr. Eugenio Garcia, for joining us, for taking on the task of this web debate on his own, and for providing the best possible and broadest overview on the topic that we could wish for, and then ending on this positive and future-facing note. So, Eugenio, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you again.
For
Good luck to all.
1 hour of intense discussion.
Please go to the website of Diplo Foundation and find the courses you can take. I talk to the audience now, the viewers, engage in the debate, participate, make your voice heard, and I think that's the way forward. Thank you so much for the invitation. Good luck to you all.
Thank you. And it was a pleasure to have you. For everyone else and for continuing your discussion, we will follow up with a summary of the debate, and we will post the recording of this debate as well. And from there, we can then continue the discussion into those different forums. Well, thank you again, Eugenio. It has been
Thank you so much. Pleasure. See you next time.
And hopefully we can do this soon again.